Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about the environment, urban and suburban communities around the world, as well as the United States, with my guest, Scott Spires. He's a writer and translator and calls himself a nomad. He is author of his novel, Abandon All Hope. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
You have been in many different countries and have seen many different environments. You were born in India, you've been to Argentina, Great Britain, Czech Republic, Russia. You currently reside in Illinois in the United States. Are there similarities in how these different places handle environmental protection and urban development?
Well, that's a very big question, and I think I'd like to point out a couple of things. If we look at urbanism specifically, the American approach nowadays is much closer to the European approach, but that's a fairly recent development. And what do I mean by that? Starting about the middle of the 20th century, we had the whole growth of suburbia. The concept of suburban sprawl became a very important thing in the United States. There was the birth of the exurbs, the suburbs, which were yet further out. And we began to see critiques of this sort of thing taking place. For example, a major milestone was Jane Jacobs' book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which came out in 1961, I believe. And then the new urbanist movement started to flourish in the 1980s and 1990s. And their basic concept was a belief that American cities should be more like European cities. And so they criticized this suburban sprawl. They criticized the lack of public transportation. They were in favor of walkable communities, a general sense of environmental sustainability. It was almost like American cities, which were boomed originally during a period of mass immigration, of gigantic growth of industry, and so they had to be built very quickly. European cities had been built up gradually over the centuries in a slower period of time. And so because of this, they had not suffered these shocks of expansion, might be a way to put it, the American environment had had to deal with.
What I find interesting is that we didn't really learn from that European experience and see that they had walkable cities and that they combined residential and commercial. Because I grew up in Southern California, which was the epitome of suburbia. I grew up in suburbia, car-oriented culture. We destroyed so many beautiful natural areas with roads and freeways, and it seems as though we're still doing it. We haven't quite learned.
Yeah, that's true. Now, I'm here in California for the second time in a couple of years. I drove up here from San Diego, and it is remarkable to me. Frankly, it's a stereotype, but it's true, just how bad the traffic is. Even just driving in rural areas sometimes, the enormous buildup and sprawl of residential sprawl in this state. I don't want to be picking on California too much, but I believe that it's what we might call a common Sunbelt problem. For instance, here's an interesting factoid that your listeners might find intriguing. Of the 10 largest cities in the United States nowadays, I think 7 of them can be considered part of the Sun Belt, the South or the Southwest. Whereas I think as recently as 1950 or so, only one of the 10 largest cities, namely Los Angeles, was in the Sun Belt. So vast amounts of this growth have taken place in the Sun Belt, and this has led to a precarious situation where, because of the climate, you have water crises in many of these areas. You have terrible traffic problems, as I mentioned. You have the whole question of heating and cooling, especially with air conditioning, because in a place like Phoenix, for instance, or Houston, it's virtually impossible to live a decent life without air conditioning nowadays, if you want to live with any degree of comfort. So the Sun Belt is one of the places that new urbanists have targeted as basically an area without much of a future, which is going to have to undergo some very major shocks.
Some of those shocks include switching to renewable energy, switching to houses that consider where they're located and use the location efficiently and effectively and more sustainably. It's always an interesting question why they haven't been doing that and why there is so much resistance to doing that when it's obvious with climate change and other problems that we need to preserve the wild areas around our cities and make our cities more livable.
Yes, that's right. A lot of it is a phenomenon of kicking the can down the road. If a problem is very big, we can put it off till tomorrow, and then tomorrow we'll put it off to the next day, and so on and so forth. There are entrenched interests involved, obviously. The lifestyle that so many people have gotten used to, but at a certain point that lifestyle of convenience will turn into one of inconvenience as the problems continue to mount.
Some of these issues were raised in your new novel, Abandon All Hope. And even though the book is not about the environment per se, you're dealing with two major protagonists, anti-heroes, who have a different approach to life and are looking at how to live a happier life. You do incorporate some of these concerns, especially when one of them had to commute to the suburbs from the downtown area because his company moved, and he saw quite a bit of difference and was discovering he was wasting time during the commute. So how did you incorporate some of those themes in your novel?
It's interesting because, just to give listeners a bit of background, it's set in the Chicago area, and my protagonists both live in the city, but the main protagonist, Eric, works at a company that's based in the suburbs. And the suburb is based on a certain part of Chicago's suburbia around Schaumburg to the northwest. And new urbanists will recognize the name Schaumburg because it is an example of the exurban town that they tend to hate, where the downtown is constituted by an intersection of freeways and where you're unable to walk anywhere. I gave it a different name in the book. But what he feels doing this sort of reverse commute is, he loses about 10 hours a week when he could be doing something else. It tires him out so that he feels on the weekend, instead of going out and doing things that might be fun, he feels like a human battery recharging itself. It sort of depletes him. It's an atomistic kind of existence. I describe his commute, and I describe the various urban and suburban zones that he goes through. These are all based in reality. For example, something that seems to be little known, I made use of an enormous automotive graveyard that's located on the west side of Chicago, or at least was located there at the time the book was set. It was a thing that always amazed me, was to go past this stretch of territory which went for a couple of miles and see all these hundreds and maybe thousands of cars just piled up on top of each other, looking like the most post-apocalyptic highway pileup in the history of the world. It made a big impression on me.
I need those old junkyards for my old car because they don't make new parts anymore, which is a shame. We have a use once, throw away society. We have, if something breaks, buy a new one instead of fixing, repairing, which was the case for a long, long time. But those big junkyards aren't too beautiful to look at.
No, they're not beautiful, but they're interesting and they're historically instructive. They say something about what we as a society have been doing for the past 70 or so years and what it's leading to. So I figured it was worth pointing it out.
The other main character in your book, Evan, calls himself a philosopher, didn't want to finish college, and yet wasn't sure how to make a living, was struggling around. These individuals had feelings of social isolation and alienation. Do you think that if they had incorporated nature more into their lives on a regular basis, that they wouldn't have those kinds of feelings to the same degree?
I think that's a question that very much depends on the individual. Your environment can stimulate you. It can provide you with all kinds of ideas, a better standard of living, but there's also what you personally bring to it. For example, Evan dropped out of college and he tried to be a philosopher, but his basic problem was partly an environmental one, partly a personal one. He grew up in a highly competitive form of suburbia where there's great pressure on young people to distinguish themselves. He had no way to distinguish himself. He just didn't seem to be talented enough or whatever, and so he was trying to create a path for himself. It was his suburban environment that imposed these pressures on him.
You dealt with the concept of being a realist or an idealist and making a commitment to one's path. I've made a commitment for 50 years to the cause of the environment, to make the planet a better place for all life, and that includes humans as well as plants and animals. But when I started, I was very idealistic that we were going to make changes. We started getting laws to stop pollution and all. But yet those in charge stopped listening to some of the environmentalists in terms of the warnings 30 years ago that we have climate change, we have overpopulation, we have environmental destruction, we need to save this wilderness area. Is it possible to be an idealist in this day and age?
If you're going to be an idealist, you're going to set yourself up for some degree of disappointment because nothing is ever going to work out exactly as you want it to. However, if you don't act at all, you will probably not get any of the change that you want. And you talk about legislation, about movements in favor of the environment. There have been very major successes over the last several decades. Here I am in Los Angeles, which was a city that was synonymous with the term smog back in the 1970s. I think it's a lot cleaner now than it used to be then.
Yes.
That's a perfect example. I've seen many cities that were grimy, not just in the United States, but in other countries that have cleaned themselves up very nicely. So yeah, progress has definitely been made. It's just such an enormous issue with so many different factors feeding into it. If you concentrate on certain specific things, you can achieve some goals. I guess it's partly a matter of don't try to bite off more than you can chew.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading this novel. It was easy to read. The characters were exploring many different issues in their lives. I had a great time. I was just wondering, are they based on you? You had some of the characters take positions that one was working to try and develop educational curriculum, another could only survive one day doing phone surveys. Did you do all these things that they did?
A lot of the workplace satire in the book comes from my own direct experience. Eric, the guy who works in the suburbs, I based his job on an office job that I had with a fairly well-known company, which I will not name on the air. It provided me with a lot of material. My experience there provided me with the original impetus to write the novel. The scene that you mentioned, which was telephone surveying for an insurance company, was a job I actually had, and I took a lot of the material from that. Now, the actual experiences that I had were not as traumatic or disastrous as the things that I describe in the book, but of course, I modified my own experience in the interest of telling the story.
It was a great story, and we'll talk more about the novel Abandon All Hope with my guest, Scott Spires, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Scott Spires. He's a writer and translator. When my guests write a novel, I don't like to tell the end because you want people to read it, of course. But how do you summarize the story of Abandon All Hope? Because I know that there was discussion about happiness, responsibility for happiness. We talked about this urban-suburban issue. We talked about commitment to different causes. Could you describe the story?
Briefly, it's set in 1998 in the Chicago area. I have two protagonists, Eric and Evan, who come from similar backgrounds, grew up in suburbia. Eric is a bit older, he's in his 30s. Evan is about 20 and he's a college dropout. Eric is essentially a realist or maybe even a cynic. He just wants to float through life without committing himself to anything. Evan is the opposite. He's an idealist who really wants to make a mark on the world, but he doesn't really know how to do it. So he's kind of flailing and floundering during the course of the novel. Without giving anything away, is that by the end of the novel, let's say that the realist has become slightly more idealistic and the idealist has become a little more realistic.
It was a great read. I could identify not with the character's lifestyle per se, but with their interactions and what they were going through and how they dealt with the different issues. But let's talk about some of the other areas of your involvement in life. You are a translator. You translate in Russian and German, and I'm curious whether or not other languages have better terminology for protecting the earth, for caring about the earth, for dealing with the environmental problems, because so often English just doesn't have the right words with the right connotations for us to love and appreciate nature. Do you find that other languages do have that?
I cannot say in my own experience that I have noticed this. I think environmental terminology, to the degree that I'm familiar with it in several languages, tends to reflect or be very similar to the English terminology. The environment, the thing that surrounds you. In Russian, окружающая среда, it means basically the area that surrounds you. In German, the Umwelt, it's the world around you, maybe a little more expansive concept, but fundamentally, I don't see much of a difference. This might be a matter just of the fact that all the languages that I deal with are Indo-European, hence stemming from a common root. You may have to go to something very different like Japanese or Chinese to find real differences there.
Environmentalists are very concerned about endangered and rare animals and plants. We don't want to see extinction. But on the human level, we're also concerned about indigenous cultures that are disappearing. They have a different language and perception of space and life and the earth than the Indo-European languages. And I know that there are many minority languages in Russia because there are different ethnic groups, indigenous groups in Russia. Are those endangered?
In Russia, as in a number of other countries, including China, India, where many languages are spoken, you have a situation where there are many minority languages which are only spoken literally by a few thousand people, and which are disappearing. And the reasons for this are, above all, economic, because the spread of a sort of globalized culture means that only a few languages dominate economic life, they dominate technology, the internet, and so forth. One thing I want to point out, as a linguist who has studied this, is often, it's outsiders who consider these minority languages to be something special that needs to be preserved, but very often the speakers of the minority languages regard them as almost a sign of backwardness. So they don't necessarily see, why should I keep speaking moksha or udege because everybody else speaks Russian, and speaking this language of my grandfather who was a peasant, it just doesn't help me. I mean, that's very often a reason why languages disappear. In fact, I developed a kind of sociolinguistic principle when I look at language extinction. I think that no matter how strong the repression of a language might be politically, if the will to speak it exists, that language will survive. No matter how strongly one may support a minority language, if the will to speak it is not there, it's not likely to survive.
It's an interesting concept to allow some languages to perhaps become extinct. I certainly don't want to see that in terms of plants or animals, though.
Yes, that's true. And I've seen studies have claimed that linguistic diversity is similar to biodiversity in that sense. But the fact is, A language is carried on as an exercise of will by its speakers, and you can't force them to keep speaking it. And you can provide all kinds of encouragement, on the educational level, on the literary broadcasting and so forth level, and you might, do a good job. I believe, for example, the example of Irish Gaelic is a good example of what can be done because it's a required school subject in the Republic of Ireland, so everybody knows at least a little.
There's a revival movement.
That's right, there's a revival movement, and at a certain point it became, so to speak, cool to be able to speak Irish again, and there's now Irish language TV shows and things like that. So to a certain extent, you can revive languages using various forms of support.
Your book focused on an urban-suburban environment in the United States, but I just want to briefly have you share your experiences living in other environments in other parts of the world. You started in India, you've been to Argentina, an area with beautiful Patagonia and open plains. I don't know how much is being protected or how much the Argentinians are doing that. Great Britain has some ancient areas that are very famous and well known. Czech Republic, fortunately, the towns, particularly Prague, wasn't destroyed during World War II and was actually kept from being destroyed. So it has that historic history that's so unique from other parts of Europe. Russia, of course, is so vast. The cities have beautiful architecture. Even the subways have each station with beautiful art, but yet there are over 83 regions. You can go all the way to Siberia and to the east and have incredible places like Lake Baikal. Do the Russians and these other people care about preserving and protecting their environment? What was your sense coming in as an expat or coming in as an American and working in those communities?
When I was in the Czech Republic, I think the Czechs have done a good job of preservation, partly for the reasons you mentioned. The cities were not, heavily bombed or destroyed during the war. They're still well preserved, and there are a lot of beautiful small towns in the country. Russia, as you mentioned, it's a very different place just because of the scale of everything, the sheer size. When I arrived in Moscow in 2005, I actually joined a little local preservationist group, but sadly they were not terribly well organized, and I think most of them consisted of expats anyway. The organizer was actually the Moscow correspondent for one of the British papers. But there was a big issue in Moscow at the time because the mayor, Yuri Lushkov, at the time, was essentially trying to rebuild the city. And so he was tearing down a lot of nice old buildings and putting up a lot of new shopping malls and more efficient type of office buildings, and it changed the look of the city considerably.
And we know that the communist regime destroyed some beautiful historic buildings and put up very junky kinds of office buildings and housing places.
Well, a lot of that was for ideological reasons. For instance, Moscow used to be known as a city of churches, but the Bolsheviks dynamited the majority of the city's churches. But the other thing that you're talking about, which was the expansion of housing, it was similar to, the growth of American cities in the 20th century because Soviet cities expanded greatly due to the influx of peasants into the city to form an industrial proletariat. Moscow in 1900 had about 1 million people. By 1980, it had over 10 million people. This is an extraordinary growth. They had to build housing as quickly as they could, essentially. And as a result, aesthetic factors didn't really factor into these projects. They had to get those projects up quickly.
Hopefully things have changed.
Things have become more interesting. You will find more interesting designs in projects. I saw an interesting development near St. Petersburg, which was very colorful and very unusual, something that would certainly not have been put up in Russia during the Soviet period. And I think there are more designs like that. Some of them are not too reliable in terms of construction.
There have been so many people in Great Britain that there's very little wild area left. It is historic, but Are they trying to bring back some of the traditional natural areas? Are they still being concerned about preserving and protecting some of the ancient places aside from Stonehenge?
Britain is interesting because in terms of demographics, it's sort of like a glass where all the liquid is in the lower third of the glass, because southern England is very, very heavily populated, one of the most densely populated parts of Europe. But once you get north of about Manchester, things start to thin out, and by the time you get to Scotland, there's a lot of wild territory, and it's really an island where you find some great extremes of difference in the natural environment within a rather small space. Now, it was recognized in the last century that the sprawl of London could run out of control, so they instituted a thing called the Green Belt to enforce the maintenance of natural space between cities. In the north, specifically in Scotland and the poorer parts of northern England, they had kind of the opposite problem. They had almost too much nature and too few people, because often they would lose people to emigration. There just weren't enough jobs up there.
Recently, though, I read where the peat moss, which is so famous on the island, is as important as having our rainforest to handle the carbon and the carbon dioxide, that we need to save and preserve the peat moss. And for a while, that was considered just sort of wasted land.
That's quite possibly true. But I will tell you actually an interesting peat moss story. You want to talk about climate change, you want to talk about how it's affecting modern cities. In 2010, I was living in Moscow. A heat wave started in the summer. Temperatures were over 90, sometimes over 100 for 6 weeks in a row. The peat started burning, around the city. Smoke was pouring through the metro. When you went down into the metro, it was like a scene out of Dante's Inferno. When I went to the office, they allowed me to wear shorts, and sometimes I would just go to the office to sit in the air conditioning, because Moscow is a cold city where people don't think they need air conditioning. And I'm just pointing this out as an example of an extreme climate event that we had to deal with. And the way we dealt with it was by getting out of town.
Another reason we should bring nature into the cities, because going out into nature, into the countryside, has been so healing in so many different ways to people all around the world. We don't talk too much about South America other than the Amazon rainforest or the Andes Mountains, but it's a large continent, and there are countries like Argentina that you've lived in that have unique environments as well. What did you find there?
Well, I have to hedge that a bit by saying that I was just a small child at the time, and we were living in Buenos Aires, which is a huge city that dominates the country. You find about 1/3 of the total population in that city. They call it the Paris of the Americas because it has, kind of a cosmopolitan Mediterranean feel to it.
It looked very European, not colonial.
Yes, they also have these vast areas to the south. They have Patagonia.
In your novel, Abandon All Hope, you had it set in 1998 in Chicago and Chicago area. And you currently are living in Lake Bluff, Illinois, which is near Lake Michigan. Tell us what's happening with those lakes. Are they clean? Are they polluted? Are they protected?
Great Lakes, it's a huge system which has its own set of problems involving shipping, invasive species, some degree of pollution. But overall, I'm optimistic in a pessimistic time about the Great Lakes for a simple reason. I've read surveys, reports by climate scientists and other experts, and the general consensus is that in a time of global warming and climate change, the Great Lakes region is going to be one of the best places to live. In fact, one of the reports that I read recently specified the state of Michigan as possibly the best place to live in the world in 2050. And why is that? Because you've got 20% of the world's fresh water supply right there. You've got one of the world's biggest agricultural regions surrounding it. You don't have a lot of extreme weather events. You don't have hurricanes or earthquakes or massive fires or a lot of flooding. There's tornadoes in the Midwest, but they tend to be inland. So the Great Lakes as an ecosystem I think it has a very bright future.
You've certainly seen a lot of different kinds of places and seen what needed to be done. You've written articles about these issues. You have also written and incorporated some of these concepts in your new book, Abandon All Hope. I want to thank you so very much for sharing your concerns with us. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having me on.
I have been speaking with Scott Spires, writer, translator, and author. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.